but the outright translation is the Shinto as the way of the gods. It emphasizes things like purity, harmony with nature, respect for family, and subordination to the group. So again, we kind of see these different aspects of some of the East Asian cultures that are less about individualism and more about kind of fitting in with an overall collective. And people make the argument that Shintoism is essentially really woven into all these different kinds of aspects of Japanese culture. So this includes animistic beliefs, worship of divine ancestors, and communication with the spirit world. And a lot of folks you all's age, right, have watched a lot of sort of Japanese anime, things like that, where we can kind of see this tracing of these kinds of aspects in a lot of the characters, right, and the situations that we see in these kinds of films. So this notion of gods and spirits that pervade all these different aspects of nature. And these are especially found in particular places of natural beauty. There's also sort of demonic aspects within this, as well as ghosts within different things as well. And so one of the things that you see on the landscape is Shinto shrines. And so there are a huge number of these, and they vary dramatically in terms of what the actual architecture of the structure itself is like and the location, but they're kind of all over Japan. And there are also certain natural features that are just thought of as shrines themselves. And one of the big pieces of it that you see is this notion of a gateway. So it's two upright bars with crossbars across it. And it symbolically separates sacred space from the external world. And so geographers, of course, are really interested in this idea of sacred space as a way of kind of setting aside an area as having this otherworldliness, this extra importance that comes with marking it off as sacred space. Okay, so a lot going on there, right? So we'll kind of broad brush some history stuff and then kind of get into what it is we see in these areas today. So one of the big things to think about is the history of the Chinese empires that, again, make up what is mostly the eastern part of present-day China. And so a series of major dynasties, and you can kind of see the extent of these through time on the map here. Sorry, the formatting on this is weird. One of the things that kind of helped shape this is invasion from nomadic people. Having the Mongols invade from the north and creation of the Great Wall of China, right, as a way to sort of defend against those empires. So one of the things I want to kind of put in perspective here, I think we've looked at this chart a couple times this semester, is if we think about the last 500 years, this area has long had really big populations, advanced technology, a lot of wealth. So 500 years ago, about 25% of the world's GDP, which is the value of all the goods and services produced in place in a year, was in China, right? So they were a big player here. What we start to see by the 1800s is this shrinks up, right? This atrophies some. And we can see it with India as well, right? And so what's happening during this time is the wealth of Western Europe, right, is especially growing, and you've got the rise of the United States here as well. So one thing to think about first is, China has all this economic power, technology. Why didn't China colonize the rest of the world? Why was it Europe? And so there was some exploration, right, and travel that had happened. They had pretty advanced ships. They had made their way across Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, the east coast of Africa. We heard when we talked about Africa, sort of the trade from the Great Zimbabwe sending giraffes to the Emperor of China. So there's long been this kind of trade set up. But the thing is, there wasn't that much that they wanted from the rest of the world. They were fairly self-sufficient in what they were able to produce, and then the threat from the Mongols sort of distracted them from expansion. So in some ways, the decision was made that it was not really worth it, and there was this pivot away from integrating with the rest of the world. And in some sense, this starts to put them at a disadvantage, right? Because they're not having as much technology, as much interaction, especially as we see the rise of Europe. And so to think about how this unfolds in East Asia, one of the first spots was Macau, and we heard Dr. Liu talk about that area. So this was a Portuguese port, and so they were interested in trying to have access to some of the amazing things that were made in China, right? If we think of the Silk Road, right, that as being a key route to try to connect Europe to some of the things that were made in China, and of course the kind of exploration of the world, trying to find better sea routes here. And so the Portuguese were one of these countries that did a lot of this early exploration. They're interested in silk, spices, porcelain as part of it. And so by the 19th century, they had set up this port, and there were other sort of specific spots where European merchants were able to get more access to the Chinese market. We've got this interesting sort of triangle that sets up around the British and their interest in opening up China. There was all the stuff that they were buying from China, silk, but also tea was a big thing. And one of the things that happens is that Britain is so dependent on tea from China, and China is like closely guarding access to the crop to even be able to grow it. And Britain gets this huge trade deficit with China associated with tea. So I want to show a little video that talks about kind of this process. Really good, sneaky stuff here in terms of trying to figure out ways to open up China. Let me share this just a sec.
But it wasn't until the 1700s that opium started being used in China in the 8th century. But it wasn't until the 1700s that more opium started to be imported from India primarily into China.
Opium dens emerge as places where people gather together. They smoke opium together, they chat. It's a very sociable kind of environment. But there is a mild level of addiction that became widespread, such that the demand for opium is huge.
During the 1830s, the volume of opium going into China greatly increased. The British East India Company became the main source of opium. And it was very important to the British because it supplied them with a vast quantity of income.
The British in the 18th century had a problem. They had a deficit in trade. They wanted to buy in China, but they didn't have much to sell. They wanted to buy silk, they wanted to buy porcelain, but most of all, they wanted to buy tea. And that tea had to be paid for.
And one of the only things that the Chinese would take from the British was silver. And by selling opium, the British generated a lot of silver that they could use to cover their costs. The emperor grew quite concerned about this because the silver started flowing out of China instead of into China, which had been the case for many centuries before. He decided to prohibit opium. There were a number of people caught and put to death or stripped of their holdings. The emperor was trying to send a very clear message to the foreigners that the opium trade was shameful and it would no longer be tolerated. His actions were what helped precipitate the Opium War.
There is great disagreement back in Britain about whether Britain should go to war against China over the right to sell opium. However, business interests are the ones that seem to have failed, and very successfully.
Was a devastating loss for China. They were totally outmatched by the military abilities of the British. The Opium War resulted in what is widely been called unequal treaties, which basically gave the British and other foreign countries a lot more rights with respect to free trade.
By the end of the century, Britain negotiates a gradual reduction in its imports into China. However, in the meantime, Chinese growers have started to produce their opium. And this is always the challenge in the drug trade. It's not stopping supply, it's stopping demand. And it really isn't until the Communist Party takes control in 1949 that they're able to bring an end to the opium trade.
Okay, any comments or questions on anything that they talked about there in the video? Ask her.
I mean, it's more related to this. Opium's still a big thing, like a big problem, not anymore, right?
I mean, they mentioned at the end of the video that there was a big reduction once the Chinese, or when the communists took over. But I'm not sure if it's still a major issue there or not.
Because opium always seemed like more like a, not like evil wave, but like a drug problem, like the past, they say.
Sure.
So I was wondering what happened to it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And if anybody else has kind of followed it more closely and has more information on that, if it's a big, if opium addiction is still a big thing in China. Of course, you know, it's also associated with heroin, right, as well as kind of, you know, coming out of that same, it's processed from opium as well, right? So there are places around the world where heroin addiction has grown tremendously, but I don't know, I've not heard much about that in the Chinese context, but okay, so let's keep going. And so we see how this starts to open up China in interesting ways. We can kind of connect it into the British actually sneaking tea plants out, right, and setting up tea plantations in India so they don't have to be as dependent on China. So one of the things that this kind of creates then is this defeat of China by the British, and also it tells us about some of the history of Hong Kong, right? And so Hong Kong became under British control for 100 years. So it has a really kind of different orientation in some ways than the rest of China, where it was more open in terms of having access to free trade. You see the influence of British government. And then also within the past couple of years, right, we've heard a lot of issues with protests and things like that in Hong Kong because there's a much higher level of rights to political freedom and expression and things like that in Hong Kong versus mainland China. So trying to figure out how to integrate these two things has been really kind of challenging. So we'll pivot a little bit, and most of our focus is going to be kind of on China and Japan here. So thinking about the history of Japan, Japan's a really interesting spot to look at because they were one of the kind of early adopters of industrialization. And so they start to pivot towards this path of modernization by the late 1800s. And there was also some regional tension that we'll see kind of weaved throughout the past, but also the present of East Asia. So we start to see kind of the rise of Japan as an industrial as well as a military power during this time period. And so part of why this is the case is interaction with the Portuguese coming in and bringing new ideas, and basically these kinds of ideas and technology being adopted in this sort of feudal system where you have the wealthier feudal lords in Japan, the shoguns, being able to kind of unite the country in this military-based democracy. And the US comes in the mid-1800s, and again, they kind of adopt some of the technology associated with that. So you get the development of heavy industry, but also kind of transitions in how agriculture's done, education, things like that. You've got that underlying cultural aspect of the social order, right, that comes out of things like Confucianism and Shintoism. And this military aggression as well. We can think about how there's limitations of the Japanese site, right? They don't have near as much land as, say, China does, and kind of limitations in terms of agriculture and things like that. So you get this expansion that happens too. So by 1920, Japan becomes a core nation, and they've also started to expand their empire and invade surrounding places. So the Korean Peninsula into China, Taiwan. And so what's kind of interesting is there's a lot of animosity, right, between some of the other countries in Southeast or in East Asia and Japan, right?